Chapter 47. Let's begin. A king gets a prize and goes to jail. Martin Luther King Jr. was in the hospital. He wasn't seriously ill. It was a case of exhaustion. It was Tuesday, and he'd given 3 speeches on Sunday and 2 on Monday, and then there were all those trips to jail and the marches and the pressures. But when the phone rang, he felt a whole lot better. Matter of fact, he felt great. His wife, Coretta, had big news. Martin had been awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. That prize is given each year to a person from anywhere in the world who has contributed most to peace. Along with the great honor, there is a sizable cash award. Theodore Roosevelt had won the Nobel Peace Prize, and so had Woodrow Wilson and Jane Addams. Martin Luther King Jr., at 35, was the youngest person ever to receive it. King gave his Nobel Prize money to the Civil Rights Movement. Some Americans were furious, and they wrote to the Nobel Committee in Sweden and told them so. But most Americans were proud. Newspaper columnist Ralph McGill, writings in the Atlanta Constitution, said Europeans understood King better than most Americans. They saw in him the American promise, with its message for the whole world. When King flew to Europe to receive the Peace Prize, Norwegian students sang, "We shall overcome." King realized that his message had become a part of a universal language of freedom. King was soon back in the United States and in jail again. He was in Selma, Alabama, trying to help black citizens vote. President Johnson's Civil Rights Act didn't solve the voting problem. It did allow black people to check into any hotel they desired, sit on buses wherever they had wished, and eat at any restaurant. But in much of the rural South, blacks still couldn't vote. In 1964, when blacks tried to register to vote in Alabama or Mississippi or some other southern states, they were likely to be beaten or to lose their jobs, even though the 15th Amendment of the Constitution says that every citizen has the right to vote. Those who kept trying to register were given impossible questions to answer or asked to pay a poll tax they couldn't afford. Selma was an old South cotton town on the banks of the Alabama River. More than a half of its 30,000 people were black. In the 1960s, the streets in the black section of town were made of red dirt. Those in the white sections were paved. The leaders of Selma's black community asked Dr. King and his organization, the SCLC, to come to town. In 1965, when King and the SCLC arrived, SNCC workers had already been in Selma for more than a year. They had worked hard to try to get blacks signed up on voting rolls. SNCC had doubled the number of registered black voters to 333 out of the 15,000 of voting age. A few SNCC members weren't happy that King was asked to come to Selma. They wanted to stay in charge, but John Lewis, SNCC chairman, was not one of them. He was thrilled that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was coming to town, and so were the majority of Selma citizens. Martin Luther King Jr. spoke out at Brown's Chapel. "Give us the ballot," he cried. A group of Selma's black citizens marched to the courthouse to try to register. They weren't allowed inside. When SNCC workers tried to bring them sandwiches and water, the workers were hit with billy clubs. That just made Selma's black citizens more determined. More than 100 black teachers marched. Martin Luther King Jr. marched with 250 citizens who wanted to register to vote. They were all thrown in jail. King, too. When they heard of Dr. King's arrest, 500 school children marched to the courthouse. They were arrested. 2 days later, 300 more school children were arrested. The evening television news covered it all. King wrote a letter from jail. He said, "This is Selma, Alabama. There are more Negroes in jail with me than there are on voting rolls." 15 congressmen came to Selma. They announced that new legislation is going to be necessary. President Johnson held a press conference and said, "All Americans should be indignant when one American is denied the right to vote." Coretta Scott King went to jail to visit her husband. She brought a message from Malcolm X, who was in Selma. Malcolm, a black leader who was electrifying urban audiences with hard facts in the spirit of militancy, had been invited to Selma by the SNCC leaders. His ideas were different from King's. Malcolm had never recognized the power and force of nonviolent action. But Malcolm seemed to be heading in a new direction. He told Coretta, "I want Dr. King to know that I didn't come to Selma to make his job difficult." Then he added, "If the white people realize what the alternative is, perhaps they will be more willing to hear Dr. King." The alternative was violence. Speaking to a crowd in Brown's Chapel, Malcolm said, "White people should thank Dr. King for holding people in check, for there are others who don't believe in these nonviolent measures." Malcolm had broken with the black Muslims who believed in the separation of blacks and whites. He'd gone to Mecca in Saudi Arabia, the center of the Muslim world, where he converted to Orthodox Islam. That experience moved him deeply. It caused him to change some of his ideas, especially ideas that called for hate and violence. He told a journalist about the change in himself, the sickness and madness of these early days. "I'm going to be free of them. It is time for martyrs now, and I'm going to be one. It will be in the cause of brotherhood. That's the only thing that can save this country. I've learned it the hard way, but I've learned it." 2.5 weeks later, after his trip to Selma, Malcolm X was martyred, killed by members of the radical political group, the Black Muslims, a victim of the violence that he had once tolerated. Malcolm X's new belief in brotherhood made the loss of this brilliant Muslim especially a tragedy. Malcolm X drew large audiences, particularly among young blacks in urban areas. Here's a crowd that gathered in New York's Harlem City.